So here we are in week 8, exploring gender and abolitionist legacies, and Robert has told us that you've all fairly much selected your sites or your topics. So our goal is to craft a shorter presentation and explore a few sites, hoping that some of these discussions actually will enrich the questions that you're investigating. But let's start with the recap of last week when we visited 2 parks in central Massachusetts and asked, in the words of Jeanette Greenwood, some big questions in small places. And you raised some questions about what sources, particularly those close studies of a few individuals, can tell us about broader patterns of experience. And these are all important questions about historical memory and attempts to construct narratives about the past. Now, Jeanette Greenwood explored the personal relationships that underlay migration stories of individuals and families in the greater Worcester area, and together we started to probe if and how those patterns might have been replicated in other Massachusetts cities after the war. We also started to question how we could more fully explore and describe the experiences of a larger cross-section of African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This week you've read Julie Roy Jeffrey's study of abolitionist autobiographies, and we'll turn from central Massachusetts to 3 sites in central New York that hopefully will provide some insight into the experience of anti-slavery activists in the decades after the Civil War, and framing our exploration around some of the reflection questions that Robert posed about your readings that you see here. Like central Massachusetts, central New York was a geographic nexus for 19th century grassroots reform movements, including abolition or anti-slavery, as well as women's rights, temperance, and labor. Now, Women's Rights National Historical Park was established by the U.S. Congress in December of 1980, and as one would expect from the name of the park's purpose centers on the women's suffrage movement in what we would now call the first wave of feminism. Strategically located in the center of the groundswell of religious reform movements occurring in central New York in the first half of the 19th century, the villages of Seneca Falls and Waterloo became the birthplace of women's rights in the United States. And the park and the associated National Historic District are comprised of 4 non-contiguous units that are thematically linked to the 19th century women's rights movement and to the first Women's Rights Convention, which was held in Seneca Falls in 1848. The previous slide had an image of the Wesleyan Chapel. Here we see the Elizabeth Cady Stanton House in Seneca Falls and the McClintock House in nearby Waterloo. The nation's first Women's Rights Convention was the work of a small group of women who developed the idea and wrote the call for the convention at the Hunt House in Waterloo nearby. At the McClintock House, members of the McClintock family met with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and drafted a declaration of sentiments that was signed by 100 delegates at the July 1848 convention. And those in attendance included many prominent women anti-slavery activists, such as Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, seen here with her 2 eldest children, as well as Frederick Douglass, one of the relatively small group of men who attended the Seneca Falls Convention. And Douglass endorsed women's suffrage in his speech on the second day of the convention. Now, Stanton is usually thought of as a part of a working pair with Susan B. Anthony. They didn't begin working together until 1851, and in 1863 together organized the Women's Loyal National League to campaign for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery during the Civil War. 3 years later, they issued a call and organized the 11th Women's Rights Convention, at which the American Equal Rights Association was founded to secure equal rights for all, irrespective of race or gender. Now, that organization founded on debates over the 15th Amendment, the suffrage that was extended to African American men but not to women, and from an acrimonious meeting of the 1869 Equal Rights Association emerged 2 competing women's suffrage organizations, the one led by Stanton and Anthony, the National Women's Suffrage Organization, the other, the American Women's Suffrage Organization, led by Julia Ward Howe. And those 2 organizations didn't reunite until 1890. Stanton and Anthony began their history of the movement in 1876, shortly after the split, and that was around the same time that Henry Stanton published Random Recollections, which Jeffrey talked about. Also around this time, Stanton and Anthony began the first volume of what became a 4-volume History of Women's Suffrage, and that first volume appeared in 1881. And around that time, Anthony also attended the semicentennial of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia in 1883. So you can see that there's a whole lot of overlap between anti-slavery and women's suffrage literature or autobiographies. Stanton published her own memoir, 80 Years and More, in 1897, and unlike Henry's memoir, both Stanton's memoir, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's memoir, and the History of Women's Suffrage incorporate anti-slavery activities as a prelude or antecedent to the women's rights movement. Elizabeth, in particular, couples the early anti-slavery commitments of herself and her husband with, I think, a sort of mentoring relationship he had in reform with other anti-slavery activists, including her cousin Gerrit Smith. So let's turn to the second property, the Gerrit Smith Estate National Historic Landmark. This was a lifetime home and office of Gerrit Smith, a nationally prominent and influential abolitionist and social reformer who played a critical role in the operations of the Underground Railroad. And Jeffrey, he makes a small appearance in Jeffrey's work, but I guess it depends again on how one views the narrative. Certainly not a large role in William Still's understanding of the Underground Railroad. Anyway, let's get back to Smith. Smith lived on this estate and conducted business out of this land office you see here on the right. The house itself burned during the 20th century. The site itself is certified on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom and was designated as a National Historic Landmark in 2001. And it's owned and run by a very dynamic and dedicated nonprofit organization in Peterborough, New York. And in the sort of drama of Smith's life, he pointed to a turning point which occurred when he attended the Utica Conference of 1835 of anti-slavery activists. And at that point, a crowd stormed the church where the 600 anti-slavery advocates were meeting and forced the group to flee the building. Smith offered to host the meeting the following day at his home in the town of Peterborough. And then he actually served as the president of the New York Anti-Slavery Society between 1836 and 39. By the end of his term, Smith was calling for abolitionists to defy the law and help fugitive slaves escape into freedom. So he emerged as something of a radical in the movement. And his Peterborough estate provided a widely recognized safe haven for runaway slaves en route to Canada, and as well as a meeting place and a source of financial and intellectual support for the anti-slavery movement. And all this is pretty familiar stuff in many of the abolitionist autobiographies that Jeffrey studies. After 1850, Smith bankrolled abolitionist causes, including the legal defense for activists charged with violating the fugitive slave law, as well as John Brown's raid on the Harper's Ferry Arsenal. But that also was something of a turning point for Smith. After John Brown's execution, Smith had a psychotic break for which he was institutionalized, and his activism took a different direction. During and after the war, radical abolitionists, including some of Smith's closest allies like James McHugh Smith, accused Smith of abandoning the cause with his support for the Lincoln administration. And also, Smith was later one of the guarantors of the bond issued to free Jefferson Davis from his incarceration at Fortress Monroe, and became an outspoken proponent for reconciliation. As you learned from Jeffrey, Smith declined to attend the 1874 abolitionist reunion in Chicago. Now, he wrote an unpublished memoir in 1856, and according to historian John Stauffer, Smith considered himself primarily a philanthropist, though he did serve in Congress, who eschewed factional strife within the abolitionist anti-slavery reform community. And for the most part, especially in the latter years, he concentrated much of his efforts on local reform. He was, however, a supporter of women's rights, though those commitments were also very local and slightly more abstract. Both his wife, Nancy, and his daughter, Elizabeth, were active in both abolition and women's rights movement, and Elizabeth in particular emerged as a leader in the women's suffrage movement. She's seen standing next to Anthony in this late 19th century photo, and Elizabeth purportedly was the first woman to wear the bloomer dress in public. And we know that Elizabeth Cady Stanton spent time with her cousin in Peterborough, and we know that another committed abolitionist, Harriet Tubman, paid visits to Smith's Peterborough home and office. The Harriet Tubman National Historical Park is the third property that we'll take a look at that's in that area of central New York, and this property is in Auburn, New York. And the park this is actually a national park, was established recently in 2014 after decades of advocacy and study. And it builds on the story of Tubman's life and activism that's preserved and interpreted through resources associated with her youth in Maryland's Eastern Shore, which is the other National Park Service site, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park in Maryland. Tubman settled on this small parcel of property in Auburn, which he purchased from William Seward on the outskirts of the town in 1859, and the park encompasses that 7-acre parcel, including that residence, as well as the residence pictured here, as well as adjoining acreage and buildings that Tubman purchased in 1896, where she established the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, and where she lived until her death in 1913. Now, Auburn was likely an attractive location because its proximity to an active abolitionist community, its settlement, a small settlement called New Guinea, of African Americans, and it's also its relative proximity to St. Catharines in Ontario, where many of Tubman's family and friends had settled, and where she had for a time settled with some of her own family, including her parents, in the years before the war. Now, Tubman, of course, came to be known as the Moses of her people, and is currently one of the most renowned figures of the Underground Railroad. Between 1850 and 1860, she carefully planned return trips to the Eastern Shore, and over the course of at least 11 trips, led much of her family and many strangers to freedom. She garnered support from the abolitionist community, including Garrison and Douglas, and Smith, and the abolitionist publications were used both to boost her public image and provide some financial support for her repeated returns to slave territory. Tubman first came into contact with the American Anti-Slavery Society through William Still in 1849 in Philadelphia, and she made the circuit through much of the Civil War and later the anti-slavery circuit and then later abolitionist circuits. However, she remained on the verge of poverty for much of her life. Ongoing health problems and the demands of supporting a large household of dependents, including family as well as other community members, contribute to her persistent financial difficulties. And one of the things I don't think that Julie Roy Jeffley really explores are the conditions of some of the activists, including people like Tubman, who may have not learned to read or write and had difficulty finding employment to support themselves and their families. And Tubman is seen here sometime after the Civil War with members of her extended family, and historians believe that the photo was taken outside of her home, perhaps near the building that she would later purchase in 1896, which became the Home for the Aged. Now, in 1869, the first of two biographies of Tubman by children's author Sarah Hopkins Bradford appeared in print. Bradford based her biography on interviews with Tubman, and she purportedly undertook this writing quite hurriedly to help support Tubman financially. The books sold well, but like many of the texts that Jeffrey studies, were considered hasty and not terribly good literature. Bradford published a second edition in 1886, for which Gerrit Smith provided a letter of support. Actually, I think he provided the letter of support for the 1869 biography. So Tubman enjoyed the at least accolades of anti-slavery advocates, if not continued donations or financial support. Susan B. Anthony introduced her during a speech at the 1896 suffrage convention in Rochester. And the illustration is the frontispiece of the 1869 Tubman biography, which depicts her really much as a foot soldier of the anti-slavery movement. This illustration obviously is of her Civil War service as a spy. But by the time of her death, her reputation was somewhat eclipsed. Um, at her funeral in 1813 and the memorial service later, the star of the show really was Booker T. Washington, who by then bore the mantle of the Moses of his people. And within 2 decades of Tubman's death, her memory and her post-war activism were somewhat eroded. One biographer in the 1930s wrote to women's suffrage leader Carrie Chapman Catt to sort of chronicle Tubman's role in the women's suffrage movement, and Catt claimed ignorance of her role. I think this points to these larger questions of memory, how memory ebbs and flows, and leads us to some about who peoples the narrative landscapes of abolitionist autobiographies and who is missing. Also, who peoples the narrative landscapes of biographies. I think Jeffrey started to point to that at the end of her book, but also raises the larger question of how people were spending their time and what were their political commitments, particularly those who don't appear in the autobiographies. I guess the most important questions are the ones that you're beginning to form about these sites and the sites that you're researching, and how you'd find answers to those questions. And as always, our final question is, are we asking the right questions from these materials and about these sites? And as always, we're available if you have any questions and you want to chat.